Welcome everyone. I'm Natalie Hepner, a student in the Emerging Media Department. On behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences, I welcome you all to Teach-In Tuesday. With Teach-In Tuesday presentations, the College of Arts and Sciences hopes to create discussion and reflection on social and cultural problems that we face locally and globally. Today's event will begin with a presentation from Emerging Media Professor Xiaowen Guan and Justice and Society Studies Professor Monica Leo about several different implicit, long-lasting, and continuing racial biases against the Asian American community. After the presentation, Dr. Guan will moderate a question and answer session. Joining Professors Guan and Leo for the question and answer session are English professors Juan Lee and Young Ak An. The following presentation has been pre-recorded.
It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. When preparing for this teaching, the beginning of Charles Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities immediately came to my mind. My name is Xiaowen Guan. I am a professor at the Department of Emerging Media and a Chinese national living in the US. Today, I and my colleague, Monica Liu, from Justice and Society Studies, will talk about the hate crime and the racial discrimination facing Asian Americans and the role COVID-19 plays in it. Before we start, we would like to clarify that Asian American is one of the most geographically, ethnically, and religiously diverse groups. For a very long time, Asian Americans have been mainly represented by East Asians who are from China, Japan, and Korea. This has a lot to do with the US immigration history, where Chinese were among the first Asian immigrants to come to the US and are the largest Asian American group in population. Today, Asian American is a term that, according to the Census Bureau, refers to a person that is descendant from the Far East, Southeast Asia, or the Indian subcontinent, including, for example, Cambodia, China, India, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, Pakistan, the Philippine Islands, Thailand, and Vietnam. Why did I say the topic reminded me of A Tale of Two Cities? Well, on the one hand, the year of 2021 marks extraordinary milestones for Asians and Asian Americans. On January 20th, when Kamala Harris was sworn in as the Vice President of the United States, she became the first South Asian, first Black, and first woman ever held this position. In February, Cleo Zhao, a Chinese, became the first woman of color to win the Best Director at the Academy Awards. In July, Sumi Lee, a St. Paul native, became the first Hmong American gold medalist at the Summer Olympics. In September, Marvel released the movie Shang-Chi and the Ten Rings, which featured a primarily Asian cast centering on the first Asian superhero protagonist on the big screen. Just a month ago, Michelle Wu, a Taiwanese American, became the first person of color and the first woman to be elected as the mayor of Boston. Along these highly visible accomplishments, on the other hand, 2021 is also a dark and heartbroken year for Asian Americans. On March 16th, a mass shooting in the metropolitan area of Atlanta, Georgia, killed 8 people. 6 of the victims were Asian women. Since the coronavirus was first reported in China, people of Asian and Pacific Islander descent have been targeted and treated as scapegoats solely based on their race. National Public Radio reported that there have been over 9,000 incidents of racially motivated attacks on Asian and Pacific Islander between March 2020 and June 2021. One of the most telling hate crimes took place in March 2020 when a man stabbed 3 members of an Asian American family in Midland, Texas, a father and his 2 young children who were only 2 and 6 years old. The attacker said he did it because he thought they were, quote, Chinese and infecting people with the coronavirus, unquote. In January 2020, a picture of the bat soup became viral on social media, pointing directly to Chinese eating wild animals at the cause of a coronavirus outbreak. In April the same year, a graffiti was found on a Korean restaurant in New York City which said, "Stop eating dogs." To those who are familiar with Asian American history, the narrative that Asians are barbaric and animal-eating subhuman is not new. The blame that Asian immigrants being the cause of diseases, in fact, has a historical origin of 200 years. The first group of Asian immigrants came to the U.S. at the beginning of 1800. They were mostly from China, recruited as coolies to build railroads and work on the plantations. Majority of these Chinese immigrants resided in San Francisco, California. This poster was published in 1882 in a San Francisco local magazine, where three specters arise above the city of San Francisco's Chinatown: malaria, smallpox, and leprosy. The poster was titled San Francisco's Three Graces. The caricature on the left depicted Chinese laborers living in cramped and unsanitary living conditions, eating rats. Both of these political cartoons clearly demonstrated the anti-Chinese immigrant sentiments because many native-born Americans blamed the prevalence of the diseases on the immigrants themselves. The anti-Asian immigrant sentiments were manifested through the print media and legitimized by political legislations. A lot of us probably know about the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Actually, 7 years before that, in 1875, Congress passed the Page Act, which banned Chinese women to come to the U.S. as they were assumed to be prostitutes and spreading diseases. The Geary Act in 1892 extended the Chinese Exclusion Act and stipulated that all Chinese in the U.S. must always carry a certificate of residence, and a failure to do so would be subject to deportation. Scenes changed for Chinese immigrants during World War II as China became an ally of the U.S. and Chinese in the U.S. were finally allowed to become naturalized citizens in 1943. This was 100 years after when the Chinese first immigrated to the U.S. At the same time, over 100,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans were placed into the concentration camps after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. After World War II and into the 1960s, drastic changes took place with regards to immigration laws. In 1965, Congress passed the Immigration and Naturalization Act, which allowed all nationalities to immigrate to the U.S. This resulted in many highly skilled graduate students in the STEM field from China, India, South Korea, and the Philippines to come to study in the U.S. The world geopolitical shift also changed the immigration pattern in the U.S. Since 2000, Asia became the top continent to send investor immigrants to the U.S. Between 2006 and 2012, about 75% of investor immigrants came from East Asia. And this trend continued in 2020, according to data from the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. The change of immigration patterns directly impacted the socioeconomic status of Asian American immigrants in the U.S. Since the new wave of immigration, Asian Americans became one of the most highly educated ethnic groups in the U.S. based on the research from Education Data and the National Center for Education Statistics. For the last 20 years, Asian Americans as a group have been leading in the percentage of population earning a bachelor's degree or higher, surpassing all the other racial groups. In 1987, Time magazine published this cover to capture the general public's perceptions towards Asian Americans' educational success, establishing and reinforcing stereotypes such as Asians are good at math. The high level of education and employment rate also earned Asian American families a higher household income than any other racial groups in the last few decades. The financial and educational success led Asian Americans to be labeled as the model minority, which perceptions have been used as a shining example of racial minorities overcoming racism and to refute the systemic oppression. The model minority label masked the 100 years of racial discrimination against Asian Americans, oversimplifying their struggles against poverty, bigotry, and systemic racism. Asian Americans are by no means exempt from racial discrimination. This last couple of years are evidenced that Asian Americans are not protected by their overall higher socioeconomic status from racially motivated hate speeches or hate crimes. And despite their overall success in educational and financial arenas, Asian Americans are also subject to systemic racial oppression, as they are often denied acquiring top leadership positions. In 2005, author Jane Han published a bestseller called Breaking the Bamboo Ceiling. The bamboo ceiling, which mirrors the term glass ceiling, refers to the professional limitations and the bias against the East and South Asians in the workplace, as they were often passed over by their white counterparts for top leadership opportunities because of their so-called lack of communication or lack of leadership skills. Despite them being well represented or even overrepresented at staff and a professional level. In 2013, the SAND Foundation analyzed the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's data from 5 major Silicon Valley companies, including Google, Hewlett-Packard, Intel, LinkedIn, and Yahoo. This image is created based on the study results showing the ratio of executives for Asian or white men and women. The intersectionality of race and gender subject Asian women to both the glass and the bamboo ceiling, making them the least likely group to be picked for executive positions, furthering their marginalization. Although the conditions of Asian Americans as a group has greatly improved since they first immigrated to the U.S., the persistent biased perceptions of Asians and Asian Americans continue to hurt them. Now, Monica will talk about how these perceptions impact their personal lives.
Some of the racial discrimination Asian Americans faced actually intersected with gender. For example, the first group of Asian American men to have arrived in the U.S. during the 1800s and the 1900s worked in laundry shops or as waiters or servants for wealthy white families. So, the domestic work they performed gave them this image of being quote-unquote effeminate. In addition, Asian American men today are subject to the so-called model minority stereotype. So they're often seen as smart, hardworking, and really good at math and engineering. But at the same time, they're also stereotyped as very shy, socially awkward, nerdy, bad in sports, and therefore unappealing to women. So essentially, this stereotype emasculates them. And this stereotype of Asian men as effeminate and asexual runs rampant in our popular media today. In Hollywood, for example, Asian men rarely take on leading roles. And even when they do, they're often presented as asexual kung fu fighters or math nerds. In fact, this stereotype is so prevalent that in Hollywood film Romeo Must Die, the kissing scene between Jet Li, the male lead, and Aaliyah, the female lead, was actually scrapped. And the reason is because it didn't test well with the audience during a trial run. And the producers were actually worried that the viewers were going to be uncomfortable watching an Asian man portrayed in a sexual light because that's so not what they're used to seeing. Now, this kind of emasculation of Asian men in the popular media has a real and tangible effect on Asian men's lived experiences on the dating market. For example, various studies have shown that Asian men get low response rates on dating apps in comparison with other racial groups. In fact, some studies show that Asian men and Black women will get the lowest response rates in online dating apps, while white men and Asian women receive the highest response rates. And more importantly, Asian men's economic success doesn't seem to be helping them in this intimate sphere. And when people are excluding a particular racial group from having romantic relationships, and as a reminder, this is something that's really easy to do today thanks to online dating apps, which allow people to filter others by race. So this kind of behavior is called sexual racism. Now, as previously mentioned, while Asian men receive the lowest response rate in online dating apps, Asian women receive the highest response rate out of all racial groups, and that's even above white women. Nevertheless, this situation actually presents a new problem for Asian American women. That is, they are hypersexualized. The women face Asian fetish, where they are being sexualized and objectified due to their appearance. And this fetishization of Asian women is often related to some Western media depictions of Asian women. And these depictions of Asian women usually come in a dichotomy. They're either cast as a dragon lady or a lotus blossom baby. So the dragon lady is someone who's deemed as sexy and alluring, but deceitful and dangerous, while the lotus blossom baby is someone who is supposedly innocent, domesticated, and submissive. Now, these two stereotypes are actually rooted in the unique history of Asian women's immigration pattern. For example, the first group of Asian women to have arrived in the US were actually sex workers who provided service to the Asian men that came here to build railroads or work on farms on plantations. And these men were prohibited by law from dating or marrying white women. So here, the sex workers correspond to the image of a sexy and deceitful dragon lady. Now, later on in history, many women came to the US as war brides or marriage migrants. And for these women, after moving to the States, many of these brides stayed home to perform domestic work because they didn't speak English. And so this new group of Asian female migrants also reinforced the image of the lotus blossom baby. So again, these fetishes about Asian women have a real impact on people's lived experiences. For example, earlier this year, 6 Asian women were shot dead at a spa in Atlanta. And Xiaona Tang, faculty at the University of Sydney, has said that this shooting is in fact evidence of sexualized racism against Asian women, particularly given the fact that the stereotypes of Asian women as brothel girls and sex objects is just so deeply embedded in our culture. We hope that our presentation today has brought you greater awareness of the historical and contemporary racial discrimination and biases against Asian Americans. Here at St. Thomas, we value diversity, equity, and inclusion. Today, we are engaging in these conversations in order to promote changes at both the personal and the institutional level. Thank you.
And now for the question and answer portion of the presentation, led by Professor Xiaowen Guan. Professor Guan is joined by Professors Monica Liu, Juan Lee, and Young Ak An.
As Natalie said, I am Xiaowen Guan, an emerging media professor here and at the University of St. Thomas. As we begin our question and answer session, please send the questions you would like to our panelists to comment on the chat. We'll wrap up the discussion around 1 p.m. To give time to our audience to send questions, let's hear initial response from our panelists. We'll start with Juan Lee from English.
Hi, I'm Juan Lee, a faculty member of English department. And first of all, I want to thank Xiaowen and Monica for getting us into this very important conversation. The pandemic has certainly forced us to re-examine the position and presence of Asian Americans in this crucial moment of history, both nationally and globally. Nationally, the US is going through reckonings on race, gender, diversity, and globally, the world is reimagining the geopolitical relations in a post-pandemic world. So in my 5 or 6 minutes, I just want to offer 2 thoughts on the positions of Asian Americans in this context. First, from an American national perspective, Asian Americans have always been in a in a very unique position in national conversations on race and racial relations, especially when national discourses and the conversations on race have been largely centered on a bipolarized rhetoric of black and white. So the questions that we have to ask here are, how do Asian Americans fit into these conversations? And where do we stand in relation to power and oppression? And what does solidarity mean to Asian Americans? And also, how do we go beyond the dichotomized view of Asian Americans as either yellow perils or model minorities? And and obviously I don't have answers to these questions, but I just want to, it seems to me that one way to approach these issues, these questions, is to go back to Asian American history and look at how Asian American history has tied with other histories and with the American national stories as a whole. And this is basically to reiterate what Xiaowen and Monica have already shown us. For example, the Asian American history, Asian American immigration history has always been situated in the context of, for example, American capitalism, colonialism, and the U.S.'s economic growth or expansion of capitalism have always drawn on labors from Asian immigrants, dating back to the 19th century transcontinental railroad periods to the current labor from Asian immigrants in Silicon Valley. So just look at the connections between Asian American history and other history. That seems to be an important way to approach these issues. And also in the case of violence against the women, Asian women in Atlanta, as Monica has also shown us, it's connected with this fetishization of Asian women, which is also connected with wars and occupational history in East Asia or Southeast Asia. So that's my first thought on how we might grapple with these issues. So how do we understand what's happening to Asian Americans in this current moment? And my second thought has to do with the global context of the rise of China and the escalating tensions between the US and China. As we know, the US-China relations has deteriorated since the outbreak of coronavirus. And right now, there's a general consensus that the US-China relation has shifted from an era of cooperation or engagement to an era of competition and even confrontation. So this can be a very difficult moment for Asian Americans, especially Chinese Americans, and who may be caught in a very terrible position in this competition between U.S. and China. Some of the concerns with China on issues like national security or espionage, trade secrets or intellectual properties, some of these concerns may be legitimate, but the point I also want to make here is that some of these concerns are also part of the same thing as the 19th century view of Chinese immigrants as yellow perils, for example, as seeing Chinese immigrants as posing danger or threats to social order in the United States. Mm-hmm. And of course, all of this, of course, was exacerbated by the rhetoric from the former president. Words like China virus has incited a view that seeing Chinese immigrants or Chinese Americans as being responsible for the spread of the virus. And it seems like the China virus is pretty much in the same thing. It's kind of like contemporary equivalent of the 19th century yellow peril, which sees Chinese immigrants as unwelcome aliens or foreigners just posing threats to the U.S. Yeah. Going forward, these stereotypes are not going to go away soon, and the U.S.-China relation is going to continue to be challenging. So this can have repercussions to Chinese Americans who try to balance their professional life and career in the U.S. with their personal professional connections in China. So yeah, that's my thoughts on this.
Thank you.
Right. Hi, my name is Yang Ok An. I was born and raised in South Korea before I came to the U.S. I'd like to thank Professors Guan, Liu, and now Lee for providing us with such thought-provoking lectures and thoughts. While historicizing what we recently called Asian hate, you also brought to our attention the ramifications of the stereotypes and myths about Asians and Asian Americans, and how the category of gender intersects with race in the dominant Western point of view. We also heard about the diversity within Asians in the U.S. Ethnically, culturally, or linguistically, Asians encompass a large group of people with different geographical roots, backgrounds, and experiences contributing to who we are in the U.S. So oversimplifying this vast group into common stereotypes often leads to racist objectifications. In that regard, Asians as people of color have shared experiences of discrimination with Blacks and Latinxes, and all these points were powerfully discussed by Professors Guan, Liu, and Lee. Now, I'd like to talk a bit more about today's topic from a literary scholar's perspective, focusing on the interconnectedness of some of the issues that have been discussed. Also, I'd like to comment on how we can rethink about the pandemic, which led some people to intensify anti-Asian racism. To do this, I'll talk about two literary works. Woman Warrior is one of the pioneering literary works written by and about Asian Americans, focusing on the challenges of living in two confounding cultures. Published 1976, it features a first-person narrator, a young Chinese-American woman growing up in California, negotiating her cultural origins in China, whose traditional views still largely governed her parents, even after their emigration to the U.S. The narrator holds more hybrid views as an American teenager in the 1950s. The narrator's uncle and male relatives were those who came to the U.S. to build railroads. As Professor Guan explained, these men's wives couldn't accompany them because of the U.S. law at the time, so were left behind in China for a long time. The narrator speaks of the tragic story of her aunt, who was left behind in China while her newly married husband went to California for work. This aunt was ostracized by the whole village when it was revealed that she became pregnant out of wedlock, and she was pressured into taking her life out of shame. Even years after the whole families moved to California, that aunt had been treated as though she never existed, and the narrator decides to tell her aunt's story and not to forget her. Through this vignette, Kingston demonstrates how Chinese men's labor, which built the railroad system in California and over the country, impacted the Chinese women left behind in their home, and how people's lives in the East and West and those of the past and the present are in fact interconnected. When we read this story, it may not be difficult to point out the unfair treatment of women in a traditional Asian society, but at a closer look, we may raise some further questions. Who paid the price for the U.S. railroad infrastructure, which is still a major artery of our transportation system? What is the lesson of history when systematic injustice is embedded in it? Just like the narrator who navigates the two different worlds, we may need to think about what or who is forgotten and who pays the price when we continue to reproduce racial stereotypes. The next piece of literature I'd like to talk about is a British apocalyptic novel called The Last Man by Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. The Last Man is particularly relevant in our time since Shelley invents in this novel a scenario of a pandemic plague sweeping through Europe in the year 2040. This futurist novel, written 200 years ago, shows how war, religious, ethnic, and class differences become meaningless when the human race is faced with the possibility of extinction. The novel dramatizes the divisions that this kind of crisis brings, something that is very close to home for us, but at the same time, it also demonstrates how isolationism cannot protect any group from the onset of the disease. It reminds us that the pandemic can bring out our biggest fear, and this leads to targeting a group or an entity as the other or enemy to be purged from us. As Shelley suggests, the pandemic should give us a chance to address these fallacies, even when we are faced with intensified prejudices and racism. I think the talk we are having today helps both to analyze our cultural blindness and to help generate the insight we need more than ever today.
Thank you so much for both Dr. Lee and Dr. On's commentary. Thank you. And I think to understand this, issue fully, we must learn it from both the historical as well as the, lived experience, right? So thank you. And I have a few questions that are coming in, and I will read them out, and you can answer them. One of the questions that I have here is our audience member really wanted to speak a little more about experiences of Asian Americans in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think we can talk a little bit about our personal experience. We can start with maybe Monica. Yeah, talk a little bit about how Asian Americans experience in the context of COVID-19 pandemic.
In terms of my personal experience, so I was actually born and raised in Wuhan, and I had come to the States when I was 8 years old. So I actually was one of the first to hear about the pandemic and how it was spreading in Wuhan. So I remember, I think it was around the end of 2019, and in our family chat group, my dad always was typing messages that says there is some kind of disease in China that is similar to SARS, and the outcome is unknown, and someone should be paying attention to that. Mm-hmm. And at the time, I told my dad, don't spread rumors, don't spread any unnecessary hype. And it was all within about 2 weeks from when I first heard from my dad that I was hearing in China that something was spreading. And 2 weeks later, we hear about the shutdown in China, and everything was being walled off. And it was at that time I actually told a lot of my students. I remember I was teaching at Colgate University at the time. I told them, be prepared to go home for spring break and not come back. So at the time, a lot of students were in awe and in disbelief that something of this scale may happen, and everything happened. So at the time, my department and my school saw me as somebody with a lot of foresight into this, and I thought, well, this part of this is just my the information I have based on my background and my family. Personally, I hadn't experienced any kind of overt racism or discrimination from the people around me, but I think that was my personal experience. It doesn't represent the experience of other Asian Americans, but so personally, I feel that a lot of people appreciated me for my foresight.
Good. Yeah. Right. Jen or Yang?
So like Monica said, as Chinese American, I was one of those, perhaps one of those groups who were aware of the spread of the virus. Although like we definitely have no idea that it would turn out into something of this scale of like a global health disaster. And I think for me, I just throughout this whole pandemic, I just try not to think too much about my own Asian American identity or Chinese American identity, or thinking about having this Chinese origin. And I personally, I didn't experience any overt discriminations or bias. Although there was in my son's class, he was in the 5th grade. At the very beginning of the outbreak of the virus, and a little girl in his class and said, "You have coronavirus." He said that to my son, and so yeah. And I mean, I'm sure that she intended this as a joke or something like that, but that kind of shows that implicit bias.
Yeah. When the pandemic was emerging as a kind of force to reckon with about 1.5 years ago, almost 2 years ago, I was in South Korea actually. So at that time, Asia faced the pandemic at first, and then Europe and the American continent seemed to put barriers against Asia, and then the table was turned when after 2 months or 3 months later. So I tried to highlight the interconnectedness of our lives, partly because living through that time, we realized, I hope, that isolationism really didn't help us, and trying to see what the impact of one part of the whole world makes on the other part, and how, and the importance of thinking together at a global scale. And we face that kind of lesson almost every day now. I think the anti-Asian racism is something that's deeply built into the culture here, and sometimes bits and pieces kind of attack us in the fabric of everyday life, perhaps. And I'm worried that those who have to deal with this issue are often those who are marginalized in the society, and we have to again, constantly be vigilant about those impacts.
Yeah, absolutely. And then to just add on to, our respondent, we're talking about, especially, Juan, you're referring to your son's experience being called, and then recall clearly that we had a Chinese family and visiting us, and we went outside in the public park, and my kid is bilingual and then started speaking Chinese to my family friends' kid, and he's a little bit older, and then he looked at my son and say, "Shh, maybe we shouldn't talk in Chinese." And to avoid any unwanted attention, because there is a equivalence of China equal to a virus. So I think in a lot of sense, even though we're lucky that none of us being called you're the virus explicitly, there's a sense of anxiety and fear of being blamed, or any moment you walk in the grocery store, walk on the street, somebody may look at you. Just over the weekend, I went to the mall, and do some shopping, and I was wearing the mask. The mall doesn't have a mask mandate, and a man without wearing a mask just stared at me, He didn't say anything, but the immediate thought, that it came to my mind is like, was it because I look, Chinese, or I am Chinese, and that's why you're looking at me? Or judging me, So I think there is a shared kind of the concern and anxiety and the fear, that we will be blamed and we will be, the scapegoat of this pandemic, because it affects everybody significantly. So thank you. I have a couple other questions that are coming in, and one of them
asking specifically about materials that we have come across during the presentation about microaggressions against Asian Americans and face it today. So do you want to talk a little bit about the microaggressions, or do you feel like when you were doing the responses, engaged?
I think we have addressed some of those, and those microaggressions. Sometimes we just fend off as minor, but once again, when those confront you when you are least expecting them, they sometimes shake you up, and especially when this multiple tensions, geopolitical and social and biologically induced fear and tension arise and escalate. I think we tend to kind of become a little bit stressed every day, and that that a subjective reaction, and then in the generalized kind of sense of wariness, that seem to accumulate quite a bit, and that's the baggage that many of us have to carry. And I think that that itself, that alone, is often forgotten. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think a lot of the research that we've been doing is looking at explicit, racism and hate crimes, racial bias. And if you look at the definition of microaggression, they are, they're simply a subtle version of the racism. They call it, aversive racism. And they're simply people who are not aware of the bias that, and then they carried it out. And an example, a typical example of it is asking an Asian person that where are you from? Because the implicit assumption is that you're not from here. And that corresponds and consistent to the stereotype that Asians are oftentimes viewed as forever foreigner, that is not being accepted or assimilated to the mainstream society in the United States. So I think those are, of course, part of this, the manifestation of the problem as well. All right, I have another question. This is more dealt with the media. This person asked, to what extent do representations in popular culture follow broader cultural attitudes, and to what extent do they lead them? Is pushing popular media creators to produce more counter-stereotypical representation a promising strategy for reducing racism?
Yeah, I think it has made a tremendous kind of shift in a way. That Hollywood has been credited to standardize phonetic kind of English for a long time. And Professor Guan showed how the representations of Asian Americans in recent days have progressed and have made some positive impact. So I tend to credit quite a bit the progressive kind of views of the media in generating much more kind of inclusive, perception, but that's partly to counter the long history of misrepresentation, right? Yeah.
I feel that this is something that just has started to change, so it's relatively newer and more recent. Mm-hmm. For example, in the past, a lot of Asian men have been cast in Hollywood films as nerdy, not sexy,
never put in the role of a romantic lead, and you really start seeing the tides changing in recent years in the film such as Crazy Rich Asians, and I think that that's one of the reasons why this film garnered so much attention.
Yep.
So I think that we still have some time to see whether these changing Hollywood portrayals of Asian femininity and masculinity will have a lasting impact on people and their images of Asian femininity and Western masculinity. So we'll see.
Yep.
And I just wanted to add that so the Chloe Zhao's award that Dr. Guan mentioned, it's I mean it's a powerful statement on how Asian women can tell powerful stories, tell very American stories. And these stories are told not just by American-born directors, but also immigrants and also women immigrants.
Yeah, exactly.
And I concur with this that shifting pattern of images of Asian men and women, and it was the woman warrior, figure, the Disney,
Mulan.
Mulan, and that woman warrior figure that seems hopefully that's a positive.
Yeah, as I suggested in my closing statement, there seems to be both the blindness and insight that we can draw from the representations, coming from Hollywood. So we should continue to be critical of some of the misrepresentations, but at the same time, we can kind of see how, as you said, the tide is shifting, partly thanks to all these social movements, BLM and Latinx, as well as Asian anti-racism movements, and that's Hollywood is listening, right, too, and so it's kind of interactive process.
Right. And I think from the historical point of view, and you can see that from a couple examples that I introduced in the presentation, that the media and politics, they go hand in hand, right? They serve each other, and they can lead, and also they can reflect. So that's why the Hollywood movement of being criticized of whitewashing, right? Of having white actors to play original Asian descent, roles have been largely changed, right? To have the Asian origin, actors to play their own role. So I think that's, the public opinion reflected a change in the media industry. And also Shang-Chi and the Legend of Ten Rings, also the first Marvel, big screen movie to feature Asian superhero, and Simu Liu, the main lead, got a lot of attention. From media attention. So is Awkwafina, so is, Gemma Chan, who is also the lead in the next Marvel movie, The Externals. So those representations speak something that, the most powerful leading industry in the U.S., in the Western world, sort of recognize the importance of representation. And hopefully that will shift, the public opinion, and also, lead the political, kind of the policy, side. So I think they do go in hand of the, together, and they work with each other. We have a few more questions. Okay. All right. So one of the questions that I have, I think it's, when we mentioned earlier the forever foreigner, phrase. So this person wanted to ask how to combat the idea of a forever foreigner with the phrases such as "you speak English so well," and what is the sorry, this question just evaded me. And furthermore, the person had noticed that in a lot of the movies the person has seen, Asian actors are portrayed as being able to speak an Asian language and English, which also enable them to see this kind of foreignness, right? So, forever foreigner.
What could you repeat?
Oh yes, how do you combat the idea of a forever foreigner?
John, you would like to answer? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I guess this. So the questions mainly it was linguistic stereotypes.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
like how like Asians are incapable of speaking perfect English.
Yeah,
Something-
you know, this is you know, phrases is such like this, you know, where, you know, where are we? They can't really tell like where we're from. Are we from here? You know, are we from the, you know, originally here, right?
yeah.
Why there's, you know, such a kind of a dominant and a popular belief that we're not from here, right? You know, so how do we, you know, how do you, as a society, combat such as target a specific kind of stereotype target against one particular, you know, group?
Yeah, I mean it's hard. It's always hard to to address these long-standing stereotypes. And as we heard from the presentations, these stereotypes have been going on since the beginning of the immigration history in the 19th century. And as for the linguistic stereotypes, this is also like the question mentioned how it's drawn on in the media. You portraying Asian characters as speaking with some accent or things like that. And I personally also got that kind of a question. Where did you learn English? And I just tried to respond that, well, I learned that in China, I learned that here. I'm an English major, and I study English a lot. So yeah, I guess sometimes I just share my personal stories. I share my personal history of
And in a way, the assumption behind that kind of perception or attitude is that there is some pure identities. That there are all we are all pure identities and speaking kind of only one, a standardized English and such. But when we look into ourselves, we recognize that there are a lot of foreignness within. Even when I teach literature, especially immigrant literature in the 19th century, 18th century, American immigration stories. All these stories tend to point out is that we are actually made up of a lot of hybrid cultures, and that hybridity actually strengthens us. So bicultural, bilingual, and extending our views to embrace and what looks like foreign but different cultures and lifestyles and experiences. That's what enriches us, right?
Thank you, Yan. And I just want to echo that. And we actually talk about some of these things in my linguistics class. I talk about this with my students. So how do we respond to dialects, to accents, to other language varieties? And we always talk about how these variations of languages, they always correspond to the speaker's identity. So they are not just random variations. They are part of who they are, part of their personal identities.
And in communication, I think language itself is also a part of the being identified as or being accepted, right? If you claim that you're Chinese and you don't speak Chinese, and the community may think that you're not really, a Chinese, right? So that is a part of the multifaceted, aspect of one's identity and what you view it as it is. And also I want to say that, that Asian has been in the latest, Census Bureau's study in 2020, that Asian as a group is the fastest growing ethnic group. And it's estimated in a few decades, by 2060, I believe, that Asian Americans will become the largest ethnic minority group in the United States. So we're hoping that with the increase of population in number and the richness, our understanding of Asian Americans' history, and we can become more
informed of the vast diversity of this group, and so that we will be truly be accepted, right, and no longer being, asked, where you're from with the implicit assumption that you're not from here. All right, that's all the time we have for the question today. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Lee, Professor On, and thank you for joining us to present this topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
We hope you found this Teach-In Tuesday informative. We'll see you on February 8th for the next Teach-In Tuesday. The College of Arts and Sciences is still accepting proposals for this event. If you would like to propose a topic, please email Associate Dean Chris Waymer. On behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences, thank you for joining us.